What's up, everybody? I'm J Rock, and you're here watching J Rock Does Stuff. Thanks for being here. So, this is the Japanese foil ball challenge. It started in Japan roughly about 5 years ago and was really a big thing. The idea here is to take foil, tin foil, and to crumple it up into a ball and then to hammer that until it's metal, basically. It's then sanded and polished. It's an interesting process that I've always wanted to try. So I saw some videos and I thought I would give it a whirl, so let's go see.
Round one, fight!
Okay, so to start this challenge, we're gonna need just a few things. An assortment of hammers, because I don't know how each hammer is gonna react to the tinfoil. And I got some tinfoil, and we got some gloves to keep our hands clean, and that's about it. So let's get going. Alright, so to get started, the first thing we want to do is we want to get our foil and we want to start balling it up. And I've seen two different ways of kind of doing it. Some people have ripped some pieces off, balled them up, added another piece, balled it up, added another piece. And some people just use one whole strip and just ball it up and start hammering. So we're gonna try the one strip method and we'll go from there. One of the things that I wanted to try to do on this was to get the center of the tin foil kind of compacted as much as I could with my hands, so that it would seem easier to compact it from the outside in when I started hammering it. So I'm trying to get the ball of foil as compacted with my fingers and my hands as much as possible. So once I had my ball made, I decided I was going to try the rubber hammer first. I wasn't sure how each type of hammer was going to react to the pounding of the tinfoil, so I just decided to kind of go from like soft to hard on the hammer surfaces. So I'm going to start with the rubber hammer and go from there. So one of the first things that I noticed about this was that when I started hammering on the top, it was also compacting it on the bottom. So there was like a double effect going on here. And I was using the concrete floor for a bottom surface, which was also textured. We'll get more about that later. So once I started to notice that double effect happening, I started rolling the foil as I was hammering it to try to keep the circular shape of the foil. One of the harder things that I found with this project and with this challenge was actually hammering it into a perfect circle, which is actually pretty challenging to do by eye anyway. I did see in a few videos some people had hammered into molds. I don't have any molds, so this is just something we're gonna have to learn by trial and error. So there were a lot of things that I was unsure about on this project. One of the things was like, how much hammering was this really going to take? And it became very apparent very early that this was going to take a lot of hammering. So the second issue that I seemed to have was, as the ball became compacted, the overlap of the foil edges started lifting. And the more you hit those areas, the more they lifted off of the ball. They never really wanted to like lay down. So I ended up having to like tear them off and then continue hammering. I also wasn't sure about the material itself, as I've never tried to hammer tinfoil before. So I wasn't sure if you can overwork foil or underwork foil. I wasn't sure when it was hammered enough or not enough. There were a lot of different characteristics working with this material than really anything else I've ever used before. I will say that it's really interesting that as you're hammering the tinfoil and it becomes compacted, the characteristics kind of change. The surface becomes more metal-like and less foil-like as you progress through the hammering process. The other thing about this challenge is it will wear your arms out, so eat your Wheaties in the morning if you're going to give this a whirl. So once I felt like the rubber hammer wasn't doing anything anymore, I switched over to the plastic hammer. The plastic hammer is what we call a dead blow hammer. It has some sand in it, and when you go to hammer, it kind of adds a little bit of weight to your swing. It also is a little bit harder of a surface than the rubber hammer is, so I figured I still had some high spots, so I figured I'd switch over to that and see what that could do. So after using the plastic hammer for a little bit, it became very apparent that I wasn't making much more progress than the rubber hammer did. Even in the high spots, they weren't going down very much, and it just didn't seem very effective. So after a very short time with the plastic hammer, I decided to switch over to the metal hammer. And in the process of using the plastic hammer, I ended up having my high spots become just a little bit higher, which was weird. So I figured the metal hammer would help bring those high spots down. So after switching over to the metal hammer, I was making a lot more progress. It felt like it was becoming more compacted together. But the issue that I was still having was the edges of the foil were still lifting up. So I would peel some back, hammer some more, and it would lift up some more. I would peel it back, and this just kept repeating over and over. So the other thing that I noticed about the ball as I was working it with the metal hammer is that the sheen on the surface of the ball started getting more shiny the more and more I started working it. So the harder that it got and the more that I hammered it, the more shinier it became. So I thought I was making good progress. And then where the flaps were that I've been fighting, there's little like fissures that started opening up. So I thought I'd be able to close the cracks in the ball if I just kept working it smaller and smaller and smaller, making it tighter. But as I was working the ball, it just seemed like it was just becoming lopsided on one side, and then the fissures, the like cracks in it, would open up on the other side. I did give it a good whirl to keep it closed though. So it seemed like the harder I worked on this thing, the worse it got. And to admit defeat for me was not really happening, but I didn't really have a choice. The whole thing basically cracked, probably a good quarter of an inch deep into it, and it just was not closing. There wasn't really anything I could do. This ball, unfortunately for my arms, was a fail.
You lose.
So I woke up the next day thinking about all the things that there was to learn in my 2.5-hour hammering session. And let me tell you, I think I learned a lot.
Round 2, fight!
One of the first things that I had to think about was how I was going to keep those dang flaps down. I decided that I was going to combat this by laying the last few layers really flat, making sure that there wasn't really any wrinkles in the creases and that everything laid down super smooth. That way, if things did start lifting, I would have a smooth tear off, and hopefully at some point we would hit a point where it was actually hammered down pretty good. So the other thing that I needed to think about was how to keep my ball round, or how to get it round. And so I decided to combat this with rolling my foil before I started hammering it in my palm to get it the most round that I could. And then when I started hammering it, to make sure that I was hammering it in like a uniform manner. So that was what I decided to do for that. So the last thing I needed to think about was how to keep the cracks from happening. And the more I thought about it, the more I figured out that it was just basically from not compacting the ball in a uniform manner. One side was harder than the other, so when I was hammering it, it would actually go from a ball to an oval, and then I would hammer it back into a ball. And I think that this process, going from a circle to an oval and back to a circle, was actually making it worse and worse as I was hammering it. So that, and the floor was also textured, and I think that didn't help anything because it was putting imprints into the surface of the tinfoil ball. So between those two things, I decided I would go ahead and give it another go. So let's see what I can do this round after figuring out that I learned a few things. After using the 3 other hammers on the other ball, I kind of had a better understanding of how each hammer worked and what it did to the foil. So with this ball, I decided to just use the metal hammer alone. I felt like the metal hammer was super effective and would get me from point A to point B in the best manner. So I went with the metal hammer. I also was going to take my time doing this. I really wanted to focus in small areas and keep the ball moving at all times. So I wanted to just do smaller taps in smaller areas just to keep everything compacting down in a uniform fashion. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this project takes a lot of hammering, probably about 1 to 2 hours, if not more, to get the ball from foil to where you want it to be to sanding. It could take a lot of hammering, a lot. I think it's also important to mention that I really just didn't enjoy the first ball. I didn't really have a good time hammering it and using the different hammers and not knowing what I was doing. But going after it the second time, I really had a zen moment while I was doing it. I was focused in onto the sound that the hammer was making, and that was allowing me to kind of gauge how much hammering I needed to do in a particular area. So it really became zen-like overall, and I really enjoyed making this second ball. There was a point when I was working on this that I started to realize that the texture of the floor was keeping the surface of the ball from going shiny. The texture of the floor was leaving indentions in the surface, and so I decided to pick up the ball and start hammering it in my hand. Once I started hammering this ball in my hand, that dual effect that I had talked about went away. So I was able to focus on just one end surface of the ball rather than having to worry about what was going on both sides of the ball at one time, which was actually pretty nice. If I do ever try this again, I may start hammering from start to finish in my hand. One of the other major things that I learned from doing the first ball is that you can definitely overwork the tinfoil. I think that was one of the problems with my first ball, is I had overworked the material, because when I was done with that ball was still hot, to the touch. It was still warm for probably a good 10-15 minutes after not even touching it anymore, not hammering or anything. So I really feel like that the first ball really took in a lot of heat, and I may have overworked that material. So once you feel good about where you're at with your ball in the end with the hammering process, we need to do some sanding, and we're actually going to use a slew of sandpaper. And this is also not an easy process. We're going to use 60 grit, we're going to use 120 grit, we're going to use 220 grit, we're going to use 600 grit, we're going to use 1,000 grit, 2,000 grit, 3,000 grit, and 5,000 grit. I also decided to use some water while sanding in hopes that the water will help keep things clean and dust free. And also, just a quick note, if you're going to use water, make sure that you get sandpaper that allows for wet and dry, because most sandpaper, unless it specifies that it's for wet, is mostly for dry. So start with 60 grit and work your ball slowly. Your arms are going to get exhausted through this process. This is a very tiring process on the arms, and the sanding is not easy on tinfoil. You'll see the color of the ball changing. Basically with each grit, it'll leave a different type of sheen on the face of the ball, and you'll know where you've been and kind of where you haven't. And so just make sure that you hit the whole ball with each grit before moving on to the next grit. A little tip would be to hold the ball at the halfway point, and then that way when you're sanding, you can actually sand the whole top half of the ball, rotate it, and then sand the half of the ball, rotate it, and keep doing this until you've covered the entire ball. I think it also might be worth mentioning here that the sanding and the hammering portions of this video that I've shown are a very small portion of what's actually being done here. The sanding and the hammering portions probably end up being around 3 to 4 hours, if not longer than that. And so what I'm showing in a few minute video is a very small portion of what's happening. So something else that I found really interesting about this was before I started sanding it, it was pretty reflective in the sheen of the ball. And as I sanded it from the low grit to the high grit, once I started hitting the higher grits, the color of the sheen actually went back to the original color of the tinfoil, which I thought was pretty interesting. So once I was finished sanding the ball, the color of the ball was almost the original color of the tinfoil when I started. I would even go to the extent of saying if you stop thinking about what you're actually doing during the sanding portion, you actually kind of zone out, and it becomes very relaxing to watch the color change on the surface of the metal. When you're all done sanding, the next thing we got to do is we got to polish this thing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use 3 different kinds of compound sticks. One is for hard metallic surfaces, one is for soft metallic surfaces, and the white one is for final polishes. And then I'm going to use a mother's polish at the very end, and then we'll see what happens. So I've started with the black stick, which is the heavy metal polish compound, and this one I noticed that the wheel didn't want to really rotate very well on the spindle on the drill, but we're just going to try to work through it. So with this polishing process with the first black compound, you could really start to see the sheen of the ball start to change. It's going back from that aluminum color that we originally started with back to a reflective sheen. And that's just with this black one. So you can see on the ball, if you pay attention to the surface, maybe even if you bounce the light off the surface, you can really see where the buffer wheel is hit and where you still need to go. Make sure you have a good grip of your ball, because once you put it onto that buffer wheel, it really wants to grab hold of it and take it out of your hands. And once you start getting some mother's polish on there, that thing is going to go slipping and sliding everywhere. So I actually have a bench buffer out in the garage, and that would have been the ideal place to do this ball, but it's really cold out right now, and I didn't want to have to set up all the camera gear out there, so I got this drill set up, and we're gonna try it with this. Something else that I think is worth mentioning here is that we're gonna want to wear gloves the entire time that we're doing this challenge from start to finish. This challenge is going to produce a lot of aluminum oxide, and that's not something that we're going to want in our body, so just make sure to put on your gloves before doing anything. So I'm just wrapping up here. That liquid polish was the mother's. We're going to give this one final polish and see how she turned out.
Perfect. You win.
Thanks for joining me for this Japanese foil ball challenge. I found it to be a lot of fun. I thought it was really cool to be able to make this into this. So I hope I've inspired you to go ahead and try this yourself. If I have, link your video below or tag me in your video so I can watch it, and we will see you guys on the next one. If you're new here, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. We will see you guys next time. This is J-Rock. I'm out of here.